Let me ask you, I'm on your channel right now, and I'm just kind of wondering who else you react to.
I'm actually scheduled to do an online event with a guy named Aaron Abke. His repertoire is a little bit more than Billy's. None of the Greek passages that you've been pulling up use the word Ebionim as poor. I'm seeing patron, like we only have the Greek.
There's no Hebrew Gospel of Matthew?
No.
He says the poor, bringing good news to the poor. So in that instance, you're saying he said Ebionim because he's reading the Hebrew.
Oh, in that case, yeah. And Jesus' response is, I can forgive sins because I am Yahweh.
Did Jesus say that?
Well, that's what's implied, and that's why the Pharisees get so mad at him.
I mean, I don't think it is, though. Jesus didn't say that.
There was a part of me before I met Aaron going into this interview, and I was like, dude, I can't wait to destroy him.
Are you being honest are you deceiving?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it clearly has an agenda. Now Aaron is deceived and deceiving more people.
Are you seeking to lie? One of you is a liar, and in doing it on purpose.
And it's like, they think they're supporting Jesus? Bro, you don't even know who Jesus is.
I would have to question their morality of honesty.
And it's wrong.
They are pushing an agenda.
Because they don't just have a conspiracy theory, they're actually doing what all other religions do, all other cults do. I asked him, Aaron, do you believe you are God?
Is this coming from Aaron? I have no clue.
You just can't make this stuff up. This guy's just another heretic. He's another Pharisee pretending to be a lover of God.
Why the sneakiness? Why the editing?
You're lying. And that's not right. I'm scared. I think they raised a couple interesting points. I won't lie.
I think they brought up some interesting points that would make anybody pause and go, oh, wait. I need to think about that.
All right.
I guess the debate's back on.
Hello and welcome to our first, and definitely not our last, debate reaction video. Cam and I really enjoyed our debate with Wes Huff and Dr. Stephen Boyce, and we had planned to release a series of response videos with a few of our friends who are biblical scholars to kind of go through the debate and talk about the different points of discussion. But then this video comes out from Anton and Stephen and Wes accusing us of lying and cheating and manipulating data and all these pretty extreme accusations. So we're going to put those videos on hold for a while and focus first on our response to this video. And I want to start by saying that we feel this is quite ironic for a number of reasons. First being that we were the only team who actually presented anything in the debate. Initially, Wes and I had agreed to a one-on-one debate, and Wes sort of quickly changed it to a two-on-two format. And I told Wes that I would personally prefer a one-on-one format, but if two-on-two was the only format that he would accept, then we could do that. And so Wes insisted that it would be needed to be a two-on-two debate, and so I accepted. And so we decided to each choose a subject of debate, and Wes chose, is the Bible reliable? And my topic of choice was, is Christianity based more on Paul's teachings than Jesus' teachings? But if you watch the debate, then you already know that we didn't even debate either of these topics we agreed on, because we were told by Anton to bring a thesis statement to begin the debate with. And so we prepared one and carefully presented it in the debate, and we wanted to show particularly our focus on the concept of univocality, stating that we don't believe the Bible is univocal, which is the standard position in Protestantism, but that it is multivocal, and we gave our reasons for citing this as being the two distinct atonement doctrines that run through the Old and New Testament, one of repentance and the other of blood atonement. And so Wes and Stephen just sort of began doing right away what apologists do, trying to tear apart our argument in whatever way they could, mostly by using non sequiturs, which is the typical strategy of apologetics. And so we were okay with that, of course, because we came fully prepared to defend our position with an entire slideshow presentation of, demonstrating all the evidence and proofs we have to back up our thesis. But the problem was that not only did Wes and Stephen not bring or prepare a thesis, but they made no claims at all that we could have really critiqued. They brought no supporting evidence that we could have cross-examined. So it was a bit of a dumpster fire in that regard. But Cam and I were lost enough on what their official positions even are on most of these issues that I had to keep asking them to clarify what they believe on these topics all throughout the debate, because I can't debate someone if I don't know exactly what their position is. So the strategy between Wes, Stephen, and Anton seemed to be that they wanted to just sort of set us up to put our necks on the line to present a thesis and evidence for the whole world to see, while they didn't take the same risk by presenting a thesis or showing supporting evidence for it. It seems like they just wanted to play apologetics the whole night, which again is fine. But in that regard, we didn't feel that they offered us any critiques that were particularly compelling. But that's because we felt like they struggled to understand our actual positions throughout the whole debate. It's pretty clear that they came into this debate with a set of projections and assumptions about us and what our positions are, and they were sort of just attacking those projections all through the debate rather than our actual positions. And so we had to continually clarify our positions because they continually seemed to either not understand them or deliberately want to strawman them. So in any case, this sort of takedown video that Anton and Stephen have made seems to strongly confirm our suspicions that Stephen and Wes really didn't understand how we're using our evidence to support our thesis, because in this video we're about to take you through, every single critique that Stephen offers us is not close to our actual position. And we want to clarify, by the way, that we don't think Wes and Stephen were having a hard time understanding our arguments or positions because they're not intelligent. They're both clearly very intelligent. It has nothing to do with that. It's simply because they're apologists. And this was actually one of the critiques that I told Wes personally, which has proven to be true in this debate and in his Joe Rogan appearance, that he often lets his apologetics get in the way of his scholarship, and it causes him to make some pretty glaring mistakes at times, such as the whole Isaiah scroll debacle.
About Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
So from our view, Wes and Stephen were simply too in a rush to disagree with us to actually slow down, listen, and understand our position. In their video that we're going to show you, Stephen says that
We spent 5 hours cutting the root. You got to cut the root. If the root is weak and you can cut it, cutting the root.
And what we're going to show you in this video, as we go through it together, is that the only thing Wes and Stephen were chopping down was their own straw man arguments. And so we'll get into that. But before we do, Cam, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing great, man. You know, I was really looking forward to, just agreeing to disagree mostly on the topic of the debate. I feel we made the best out of the conversation that we could, given some of the circumstances. I mean, it wasn't the best moderation, and the format and everything was a little all over the place. But ultimately, with the amount of speaking time that we got and everything matched with, like you said, Stephen and Wes, I feel just kind of getting into the weeds on some of these topics and linguistics rather than actually engaging our core argument. It definitely felt like the whole topic was really missed, and it's apparent in this reaction video. But I think first we should address that Wes did in fact do a post on his Instagram where he's talking about the congregation of the Ebionim in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I do just want to emphasize that, Wes, I guess he's apparently traveling right now. So Stephen is speaking on behalf of Wes in this video, and we're even going to show how some of their opinions align throughout. So maybe let's start there and just talk about that particular designation and some of the claims that he's making.
Yeah, Wes put out a post agreeing with us, actually, that the designation congregation of the Ebionim, or community of the Ebionim, in Hebrew it's Pesharu al-Adat ha-Ebionim, that designation is in fact in the Psalm Pesher, just as we said in our presentation. What Wes says to try to debunk that is that this designation in this exact word order doesn't appear anywhere else in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But that's a bit of a non sequitur because the Ebionim, is the word we're actually focusing on. And that term, Ebionim, is very widespread throughout Qumran. Even Wes in his post agreed that that exact designation appears twice in the Psalm Pesher. But what we're going to show you guys with Dr. James Tabor in another video is that Ebionim is very widespread. Ebionim occurs at least 8 times in distinct different scrolls. And the word Ebion, or the poor, and other such tertiary terms for it, like the meek, the downtrodden. This theme of those who are poor is all throughout Qumran, and it's very widespread, and no Dead Sea Scroll scholar would disagree with that.
Yeah, I would just add too that I think he's focusing on this, and once we get into our presentation that we are discussing in the debate, which Stephen is trying to tear apart here in this reaction video, that you'll see that it's actually not even something that we ourselves were necessarily claiming. We're just referring to Dr. Robert Eisenman and Wise, who make in their book the statement that Ebionim is widespread throughout the community. I mean, we can obviously see it for ourselves when we look at the documents, but we're really referring to their scholarship. And in general, I feel, I could be reading it wrong, but my assessment is that Wes has led his post with talking about the fact that this is in the brackets to make it seem as if there's just this made up term that's not actually there in the document, but then goes on to admit that it is in the document. So I find it interesting that he's focusing on just particularly the fact that we used the placement that has the brackets. They're focusing on these little details that aren't actually a part of our core argument. Our point isn't that the Ebionim is in the Dead Sea Scrolls and our thesis ends there. It's who are they? What are they about? How do they connect to Jesus? And how do they connect to some of these later movements that the church fathers are writing about? And what thread is here so that we can really understand what Jesus and his earliest followers were all about? And our core part that we did get to, argue a little bit in the debate is the fact that they rejected blood sacrificial ritual. And so we're going to discuss that today as well.
Yeah, well said, man. I appreciate what Wes is trying to do here with the non sequitur about the term not appearing anywhere else, because this is what apologetics is. If you can't deal with the core of someone's argument, you go to some tertiary thing and try to deflect the attention to that. So he's doing what apologists do. But we're going to just keep telling the truth and showing the evidence and let the evidence speak for itself. I thought we had a fun, friendly, and respectful debate with Wes and Stephen 2 weeks ago. But I guess they didn't feel the same, or at least they didn't feel that it went very well for them, because they've now put out this big, dramatic hit piece video accusing us of lying and manipulating data and intentionally deceiving people. And I couldn't help but think, Cam, that I've never seen somebody win a debate and then go on a tirade on the internet accusing their opponent of cheating and lying.
You're lying.
One of you is a liar, and in doing it on purpose.
It shouldn't matter if you think they're stupid or lying, because you beat them, right? But on the other hand, how many times have we seen someone lose a debate and then go online and smear their opponent and accuse them of lying and being stupid?
Now I see what's going on. This is an actual setup. Oh, and I can see him on his screen on ChatGPT trying to look for the answer real quick. This was bogus and unprofessional and something I would never want to be a part of. Absolute total trash.
That happens all the time. So to Cam and I, this whole video was a kind of subconscious admission of what we both felt after the debate, which is that Wes and Stephen didn't feel very good about their performance. We went through the whole slide presentation with them. We offered all of our evidence to the world, and they didn't have any of these critiques during the debate. And we could tell that probably flustered them a bit, because they probably weren't expecting that. So they took a couple weeks off to go through our slides again and figure out how they're gonna come and attack it. And so that's fine, they're welcome to do that. But if they really thought that this is all just kooky, crazy nonsense that makes no sense at all, then why go to all this trouble to make us look like liars and deceivers and frame us this way? This is a principle of applied psychology. A person doesn't attack something that they're not threatened by.
I would have to question their morality.
People who attack opposing views do so because they feel threatened by them.
I guess it boils down to the fact that, I'm sure there's things that we agree on as followers of Jesus, But there's clearly some things that we disagree on, namely around this animal sacrificial ritual piece and who the Nazarenes really were, which we'll, talk about today. But the difference is that we weren't planning to make a piece, calling Wes and Stephen and Anton liars or deceivers or anything that. And we just find it interesting that that's the first reaction and approach after 2 weeks looking into this material.
I mean, we actually gave Wes and Stephen an open invitation to stop us, or I did at least. I gave Wes and Stephen an opportunity in the debate to say, hey, if you want to stop me about any of the sources on the screen or whatever, feel free to do that, and I'll be happy to address it for you.
And I'll just rip through this really quick so we can save time. But if there's anything you guys want to go back to, make a mental note, and we'll happy to go back to it.
So all of this framing to us just feels a little bit silly and dramatic because we clearly have nothing to hide. We presented our evidence on PowerPoint slides for the whole world to see during the debate. So I think it's important that we call this for what it is. You guys don't like what we're teaching about the true story of Christian history and the fact that the first Christians were not Hellenistic, Greek-speaking Gentiles. They were Hebrew, Aramaic-speaking Jews, the Nazarenes and the Ebionim. And so this is what we were sharing in our thesis of the debate, that these Jewish Christian groups are likely connected to the Dead Sea Scroll group. And that's what we're going to show you again today in our presentation. So I guess with all that being said, Cam, let's jump into the video, yeah?
Yeah, let's do it.
According to Tabor, the Dead Sea Scroll community was a baptizing, messianic, apocalyptic group with a teacher of righteousness, 12 council members, and 3 appointed priests. And that specifically comes from the community rule. They describe themselves as preparing the way of the Lord in the wilderness. They call themselves the people of the new covenant. They see themselves as the temple of God. They forbid divorce. They share everything in common and oppose animal sacrifices. So right there, we see a lot of commonalities with the Jesus movement in the New Testament.
There are things that he just said about from Tabor about the perspective of the Dead Sea Scrolls, looking at these words like the righteous teacher, the wicked priest. I mean, when you start getting into this discussion, he's talking about the War Scroll, the Habakkuk Pesher, and the Nahum Pesher. And he has done entire videos, and he has broken them down in his videos. He actually has one on why the 12 disciples oppose Paul or something like that. It's worded something like that. And that Paul's gospel is a false gospel. And he actually starts using these texts, the Dead Sea Scroll text, to like make these kind of comments about the wicked priest. And so I thought that was interesting that he brought it up.
Okay, so this was one of the more strange non sequiturs from Stephen in this video, because my slide didn't say any of that. I read a quote from Dr. James Tabor's course, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then Stephen says what he just said, and then starts bringing up a completely different presentation of mine, which I gave privately to my 40U students last year, called The Gospel Conspiracy, which has nothing to do with the presentation we showed in the debate. And so my first question is, Stephen, why do you ignore the multiple succinct parallels Dr. James Tabor just drew in those slides between the liturgical structure of the Dead Sea Scroll group and the Jesus movement in the New Testament? Because what you just read there are some shockingly strong parallels. And the most notable one being opposition to animal sacrifices, as is in our thesis. There is only one Jewish sect that we know that held that belief in the first century, and that's the crux of our thesis. But again, both you and Wes ignored that part of our presentation. And so, I don't know, maybe you agree that these are very strong parallels connecting Jesus to the Dead Sea Scroll group. So I'll play a few more moments of Stephen talking about the Gospel Conspiracy presentation just to show you kind of the context.
And he actually starts using these texts, the Dead Sea Scroll text, to like make these kind of comments about the wicked priest. And so I thought that was interesting that he brought it up.
So again, I'm not asserting these things. I'm reporting what Dr. Robert Eisenman, Dead Sea Scroll scholar, what he's asserting. This is his theory, not mine. And I just found it to be an interesting theory. To give viewers some context, again, this is a presentation that he's referring to in my private community. So either he purchased it and joined my community to watch it, or somebody who else did gave him the password or whatever. But this presentation's not publicly available. And what I'm trying to do is educate my students on first century history of Christianity and the great schism between Jewish and Gentile Christianity, which to me really boils down to Paul versus the 12 disciples. Some scholars refer to that as the Battle of the Apostles. So that's what the gospel conspiracy is about. And later in the presentation, I give this theory from Dr. Robert Eisenman just to show mostly how much scholars are aware of this great schism, to the point where one of the most prominent Dead Sea Scroll scholars, in Dr. Eisenman, believes that some of these characters might actually be referring to Paul and James and Ananias and so forth.
So he goes into this because he's talking about the war scrolls, he's talking about the Habakkuk pressure, that James the just is actually the righteous teacher.
Exactly.
Paul is this false, teacher, the one that's telling, and then you have the evil and wicked priest, that's Ananias, who had James the just killed. Now, none of us deny the idea that James was a truly righteous man. He was killed, and Ananias had that done to him, like any of that. But he's trying to make the argument that these texts were predicting, or not predicting, excuse me, they were actually discovering the true Christian identity of falsehood that was going on, and that these texts were actually written in the lifetime of James and Paul and Ananias.
So Stephen's just bringing up a scholarly theory that I give in the presentation from Dr. Robert Eisenman. But what's funny about this is that Christian apologists always get really triggered by the fact that I share this theory in my classes, because again, it's very threatening to their religious beliefs about Paul. And so they try to castigate me for teaching this theory to my students, like I'm making up some crazy conspiracy theory. But again, I'd like to remind everybody, I'm not a scholar. I don't want to be a scholar. I read and research the work of scholars. And so this is Dr. Eisenman's theory, not mine. So if you're upset about it, take it up with Eisenman. I'm just reporting what Eisenman says, so don't shoot the messenger, kind of thing. But to say that, I think this is definitely true and everyone should believe it is just sophistry. I don't say that in the presentation. It's just an interesting theory that I like to discuss in relationship to the Paul and the 12 conversation. So with that out of the way, let's keep rolling.
They're looking at it and saying, no, these things were written actually during the 1st century CE, which some of them are. So, because there's...
So Stephen right there just said that we somehow believe that the Dead Sea Scrolls are 1st century CE, when in fact we said the exact opposite in the debate. We emphasized that they were as early as the 3rd century BC. And the point we were making was around that, because we were showing their liturgical structure, the atonement baptism, and specifically the opposition to animal sacrifices. Now, we do feel and know that there are some scrolls that are 1st century, like he just said, they're the war scroll, but that's not the point. We're talking about this group that goes back before Jesus emerges from and continues after Jesus as a movement opposing animal sacrificial ritual.
The description of the Ebionites is crucial to our understanding of these texts and the widespread use of the term Ebion/Ebionim, or poor ones, in Qumran. These Ebionim held the memory of James, the brother of Jesus, in the highest regard, while Paul they regarded as the enemy or antichrist. The use of the term Ebionim as a self-designation at Qumran is widespread, most notably in the Pesharim, hymns, and community rule. So here we have 3 quotes I pulled out of this self-designation appearing in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Aaron, sorry, I just want to do justice to the audience. That just said Paul was the Antichrist. Wasn't this written way before Paul? Or
yeah, I think Eisenman's referring to the Ebionites.
Okay, so
this is post 70.
This is
Ebionites did hold that position. They did not.
Okay.
Paul,
sorry, I just wanted to clarify.
They thought his parents were Greeks. Yeah.
So Stephen doesn't appear to realize this here, but he's actually connecting to our thesis, because he agrees that the Ebionites rejected Paul. And we see that same notion of the Jewish Christians rejecting Paul in the book of Acts. This is another really strong connection between the Ebionim of the 1st century and the later Ebionites, which is just the English transliteration of the Hebrew Ebionim. So if the name being identical isn't enough to tie them together, we have no less than 4 very strong and unique beliefs or practices tying them together as well. Opposition to animal sacrifices. Both the Ebionites of the 1st and 4th centuries believed these things. Opposition to animal sacrifice, atonement baptism, communalistic living or voluntary poverty, and the rejection of Paul. So that's actually what we're trying to prove using that quote, and Stephen agrees. So that's great. All right, let's keep rolling.
Now, what Eisenman's saying here is that the Ebionim, the Ebionites go back to the Ebionim from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, for example, the Pesher on the Psalms, fragment 1 through 2, column 1, line 23, we have this self-designation, the congregation of the Ebionim, the community of the Ebionim. And so here's the Hebrew from the actual document, the Psalm Pesher.
Do you want to say anything there, Stephen, on that first one?
I guess my point on this is that we, and people that watch the debate, we spent a lot of time talking about how similar does not mean same. Like that kept coming up. I kept saying it, then Wes started saying it. Similar is not same. This continued agenda that the Essenes and the Ebionites were on the same page is actually a bad way to go.
So again, to clarify, we are not saying that the Essenes and Ebionites are the same sect as Stephen is claiming. We were very clear about this and specific about this in the debate.
I don't think there's any scholars who would say that the Essenes are the Ebionites definitively. And we're not saying it definitively either. We're saying the evidence is highly intriguing to us, and we think it's pointing in that direction or converging in that direction.
We said that the word Essenes is nowhere in Qumran. That designation doesn't appear anywhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the self-designation Ebionim does appear to be widespread in Qumran. And so scholars don't really know where that name Essene comes from. We have Josephus, Philo, and Pliny using it, but it's just an English transliteration of the Greek esaloi, and scholars are not sure where that word comes from. So Essenes may have been like a colloquialism or a common name for them among other Jewish sects of that time, but it's clear that the Dead Sea Scroll group themselves didn't call themselves Essenes. And so the only self-designation that does stand out strongly in Qumran is the poor ones, or the Ebionim.
Ebion means the Jerusalem community.
I haven't looked at that particular passage in Jerome, so I
Well, I
can't
showed it
speak
on
to it
the screen.
specifically.
Do you want me to put it back on the screen?
But the thing that we're getting back to on this,
And that's the point that we're making.
actually was reading, I actually have a statement right here where it says, here again, we encounter a problem of definition like Epiphanius Schokes seems to call all Jewish Christianity Ebionites. However, most modern researchers reserve this term for the more extreme forms of Jewish Christianity, especially those holding to adoptionist Christology, opposed to any form of preexistence. An ideal of poverty is also a characteristic of Ebionism.
Oh, gotcha, bro.
Yeah, so that's exactly what we're trying to say. He doesn't, again, I think realize it, but he's connecting to our thesis in that he's trying to debunk the Ebionites with, funny enough, what appears to be maybe a student dissertation. I don't know. He's kind of like hesitating to say it.
I actually have a statement right here where it says, here again, we encounter.
Again, he accuses
He
us
almost
later.
says it twice, but then he stops himself.
And so this is what, and this is the dissertation, by the way.
Right. And then ironically, he's, kind of telling us that we're not citing our sources later, but I find it funny here that he's not.
By the way, notice that he puts no citations to any of his stuff.
Like we said, voluntary poverty is a characteristic of Ebionism. So he's actually proving our point here in this moment.
An ideal of poverty is also a characteristic of Ebionism. And this is the dissertation, by the way.
Yes, and there's only one Jewish sect we know of that practiced voluntary poverty, which is the first century Jesus movement as described in Acts and in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And as Stephen pointed out, that's a direct connection to the Ebionites of Epiphanius' day. So it looks like Stephen may be accidentally realizing in the moment some of our connections here, which is pretty profound.
He keeps a good poker face on, though. I'll give him that.
Ebionites. However, most modern researchers reserve this term for the more extreme forms of Jewish Christianity, especially those holding to adoptionist Christology.
This is also another example of the bias and distortion of Christian history as coming through the Catholic Church Fathers and their opinions and beliefs, because he just said Ebionites is, that's how they classify the extreme groups of Jewish Christians who have ideas like adoptionism. Wait a minute. We proved in the debate, and they agreed, that the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew is the oldest written account or gospel account of Jesus.
But we have over
We
12
know that-
church fathers attesting to the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew that it was written in the Hebrew
Yeah.
dialect. Jerome says he translated it from Hebrew to Greek and Latin, and we have 48 surviving quotes from it as well.
So I'll let Stephen address that because he does have done some research on that.
And in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, we have the whole baptism account in the mouth of the church fathers. Jesus is seen as being adopted as the Messiah in that moment of his baptism. In fact, the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew has the dove descending and entering Jesus's body, which is a much more mystical depiction of that adoption than we have it in the Synoptic Gospels, where the dove just kind of rests on his shoulder. They're trying to show that indwelling presence, that realization of godhood that Jesus had at his baptism, that the Synoptics removed. So this is the oldest and original position of the very first followers of Jesus. The oldest records we have of Jesus's followers and disciples shows that they were adoptionists. They did not think Jesus was like a Greek demigod who pre-existed in the heavens and came down to earth, fully God, exclusively God. So they believed Jesus was anointed by God, hence the word Messiah, or Christ means the anointed one, Hamashiach. And so they believed he was anointed, not the pre-existent deity as the Gentiles later came to believe. So this is another case of later evolving theology of the Catholic Church, then being used as a weapon to condemn the original Christians, the Nazarenes and the Ebionim.
Is that just because a Jewish Christian group who observes Torah shows up and has a high value of Torah doesn't mean they're a part of the same groups, because there's actually a difference here.
So again, no, we're not saying, oh, these groups look similar, so they must be the same. This is just a straw man from Stephen. We're not saying, oh, they're the same because they look similar. We laid down over 20 lines of evidence showing direct and striking connections between these groups, including church fathers, Dead Sea Scrolls, New Testament quotes, and we showed that the book of Acts says almost word for word that this group shared everything in common and donated all their possessions to the community, almost word for word what the Dead Sea Scrolls say.
Word for word. Word for word.
That's an incredibly striking and significant connection. So all of these points Stephen's trying to make here are irrelevant to our thesis because we have textual proof from many different sources confirming these exact 3 to 4 unique beliefs and practices. Again, voluntary poverty, as Stephen just said, atonement baptism, opposition to animal sacrifices, and if you want a fourth one, the rejection of Paul as an apostate from the law. Acts is very clear about this, that the early Jewish Christians completely rejected Paul and even tried to put him to death multiple times. And we know that the Ebionites of later centuries also repudiated Paul. And so again, we know of no other Jewish sect in existence who share these views in common. So let's continue.
And I don't want to be rude, but if you're dismantling the foundation of Christianity, you should double check. Like, I know we're giving him the benefit of the doubt. I might be a little bit more stern than you. I mean, this is a big deal.
So that's just the thing. They think we're trying to destroy Christianity when we're actually trying to do the exact opposite. We're here to reveal the true Christianity at the root of their own tradition, which is the Nazarene Ebionim Christian movement of the first century before Paul came on the scene and the church father orthodoxy.
Yeah, I felt like that was kind of a Freudian slip from Anton in some ways, saying that if you're trying to dismantle the foundation of Christianity, it's like, whoa, bro, why are you projecting that onto us? We're not trying to dismantle the foundation of Christianity. How could we dismantle the foundation of Christianity by just trying to show that Jesus could have been part of or emerged from the Dead Sea Scroll group? How is that dismantling the foundations of Christianity? This is, reflective of what I've said already, is that what we're sharing simply threatens their religious beliefs. And so we're getting all these ad hominems as a result of it. But that is not our mission. We are here to resurrect the true history of Christianity, as Cam said.
Yeah, it's almost like, Stephen himself said he was hacking at the roots for 5 hours. What he believed to be was our argument, but was actually a straw man. Really, what he was hacking at the root of is he wants to fully remove the first and even really second century almost root of Christianity completely and start Christianity in like 300 AD with the writings of these church fathers and their opinions on who these groups were.
Yeah, it definitely feels really good to the ego to build up a straw man and then tear it down and attack it. But we kind of felt the whole debate like we're like over here 50 feet away, ready to debate, and Stephen and Wes are over in the corner like building straw men and tearing them apart. And we're like, hey guys, we're over here. You guys want to debate our actual arguments? Kind of an interesting dynamic, but let's continue.
Yeah.
on the surface, like, okay, Hebrew, Matthew. Well, it is because, again, they are pushing an agenda. They are pushing this idea that there was this Hebrew Matthew, which I've tried. And if you watch the debate, I demonstrated they have a misunderstanding of what that looked like in its organic form and who had it and who didn't have it.
Trying to push an agenda. That's funny because I'm not even sure what that actually means in the context of the debate. It's like, we're just stating our thesis. Should we not actually argue our thesis in the debate? Should we just lay back?
Are you accusing us of trying to prove our own point?
No, it's an agenda, Aaron.
Clearly has an agenda.
Well, it's like this was a debate, so we actually brought a lot more than just an agenda. We brought a whole thesis and we presented it and we gave the evidence for it. So, I mean, Anton is correct. Our agenda was to prove our thesis.
Or at least have a really good conversation about it where we're actually talking about the thesis, which we kind of didn't. So,
which really didn't happen, but that's okay. We can talk about it now, right? Oh, now we're going to get into the Hebrew gospel, bro.
But Irenaeus may be referring to a Hebrew Matthew. Then again, he may not. And the reason he may not be is because in the debate I demonstrated to our friend Aaron and Cam, I made the point in the debate that Jerome was speaking of the Hebrew Matthew that he had received from Pamphilus, who took a transcript of it from the library of Caesarea. The Ebionites were one of the groups that wanted him to translate it. Why? Why did they want Jerome to translate this Hebrew Matthew? Because if they already had it, why do they need it?
So this is one of the most unbelievably shocking things I feel like Stephen says in this entire video. And this is the same piece that he was trying to hammer us with in the debate.
He is saying that it's something the Ebionites want, which means it's something they don't have.
Which is that Jerome had the Gospel of the Hebrews, and the Ebionites of Epiphanius' description did not have it. Therefore, why would the Ebionites of Epiphanius' description be asking for the Gospel of the Hebrews if they actually had it? And I was trying to understand, where did he get the idea that the Ebionites asked Jerome to translate their text? So all that we can, unless he's got some other quote that I'm not aware of, all I can imagine that he's talking about is Jerome in his commentary on Matthew, where in his commentary on Matthew 12, he says, "In the gospel which the Nazarenes and Ebionites use, which I have lately translated into Greek from the Hebrew, and which is called by many the original Matthew." Like, we aren't sure where Stephen's getting the idea that Jerome was asked by the Ebionites and Nazarenes to translate the Hebrew gospel for them, because this quote clearly reads as if Jerome came to the Nazarenes and the Ebionites and asked them for their copy, and he translated that. I don't know, maybe he knows of some other quote that we're not aware of. But Dr. Edwards shows pretty clearly in his book as well that Jerome got the Hebrew gospel from the Ebionites and Nazarenes and translated it from Hebrew into Greek and Latin, not the other way around. So we're honestly a little stumped at how someone as clearly smart as Stephen is could come across or just come to this exact opposite conclusion from what Jerome actually says.
Yeah, it was quite confusing because we have, again, a dozen church fathers all the way back to Papias in 80 AD. Now we have Irenaeus in 180 AD attesting that the Ebionites used the gospel according to Matthew. The Nazarenes used the gospel according to Matthew. Hundreds of years before Jerome in this quote is writing. And so if we know they already had the Hebrew gospel for hundreds of years prior to this, why would they suddenly not have it and then ask Jerome to translate it for them? Jerome is saying the opposite. He's saying basically he got it from them, and he also has heard that it's preserved in the library of Caesarea. He doesn't even say he went to the library of Caesarea in that quote. He just says he knows of it being preserved there. So yeah, we wanted to clear that up because that, I think, buttons up some of the confusions that we had between our two camps on this topic.
And another little detail or flub from Stephen here that I want to point out in regards to the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, or the Gospel of the Hebrews, is that he says that Jerome got it and translated it from Pamphilus.
That he had received from Pamphilus, who took a transcript of it from the library of Caesarea.
Now, that's interesting, and it could just be a subtle mistake, but Pamphilus was actually executed 30 years before Jerome was even born. So it kind of raises the question to me if Stephen's even really looked into this very deeply, if he's, messing up where Jerome got it from, messing up the fact, or completely reversing or making the opposite claim that Jerome somehow had this and the Ebionites asked him for it when he got his copy from the Ebionites. You see what's happening here? So anyhow, the point that I wanted to make is that the one really interesting piece in regards to our thesis is that when Jerome translates this document from the Nazarene Ebionites, which we know from Epiphanius has preserved in the document these quotes from Jesus against sacrifice, such as, "I came to abolish the sacrifices," and rejecting the consumption of the Passover lamb in place of, the Eucharist of the bread and the wine. Maybe an aha moment happened for Jerome, because just a couple years later, Jerome writes in Against Jovianus this super impactful quote, which is the thesis I kept making throughout the debate. I see in the scripture, with that ideal that I mentioned in the kingdom of heaven and the Garden of Eden in the beginning, about the beginning and the end of God's ideal in the Garden of Eden and kingdom of heaven. So listen to this. It says, and by the way, this is paraphrased a bit, so don't get upset, Stephen.
This is manipulating quotes. That's what it is.
We crammed the quote together for time. He says, "The eating of flesh was unknown up until the big flood, but since the flood, they have had the strings and stinking juices of animal flesh stuffed into our mouths, just as they threw in front of the grumbling sensual people in the desert. Jesus Christ, who appeared when the time had been fulfilled, has again joined the end with the beginning, so that it is no longer allowed for us to eat animal flesh." Now, the much longer quote we'll put on the screen here for a second if you want to read the whole thing. But again, I find it interesting that Jerome, after translating this, wrote such a powerful statement similar to our thesis as kind of an aha moment. And so my challenge to Stephen would be, hey man, just look a little deeper into this, get the details a little more ironed out, and don't wait until later in your life to do it like Jerome did.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what other passages were in the Hebrew gospel that we don't have today. We only have 48 some odd quotes out of 2,200 lines, I think, of the Hebrew gospel. But there's probably some other stuff about eating animal flesh in there from Jesus, because here we have Jerome, the translator of the Latin Vulgate and one of the foremost church fathers in history, saying that once Christ has come, joined the end to the beginning, we no longer eat flesh. So, I mean, Jerome seems to think here that Jesus's crucifixion, death, and resurrection put us back into the garden, so to speak, where there was never supposed to be killing and eating of one another, but living in harmony, as it says in Isaiah 11. And Isaiah 11 really is the crux of our entire thesis.
Which, by the way, is where the Hebrew Nazarene root comes from, the netzer, the branch in Isaiah 11, and also the Ebionim are mentioned there.
Yes, and there will be no more killing on my holy mountain.
And some would go so far as to argue, and it seems like Jerome was actually hinting at this, that what they had was not a gospel of Matthew, but what was called the gospel of the Hebrews. And that's exactly even what Aaron admits in one of the other quotes that we're going to look at in a minute. So what they're calling the gospel of Matthew is probably the gospel of the Hebrews, not the gospel of Matthew in its original Hebrew form. That was found in the library of Caesarea, because the Ebionites by Jerome's day are admitting they don't have it. They wanted it because they didn't have it.
So we're just going to lay out our full presentation on the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew here, because we didn't get to go through more than a couple of proofs during the debate. But I do have to say, I have a hard time following Stephen on this and understanding exactly what his argument is, because he seems to be trying to grasp at this idea that the Hebrew gospel and the gospel according to Matthew are two different gospels. But that is false. And the work of Dr. James Edwards, which I derive all this information from, incredible book called The Hebrew Gospel and the Development of the Synoptic Tradition, All of the work we are going to present in about the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew comes from this book from Dr. Edwards. And I saw 2 podcasts that I showed to you, Cam, from Stephen and Wes discussing briefly their view of the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. And it was clear that neither of them were very familiar with the literature on this subject, because Wes said he didn't think there ever was a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah, I would say he's probably being liberal on saying that there are that many early church fathers who refer to Hebraic Matthew.
And he also said that when Papias says that it was written in the Hebrew dialect, that just means it was written in a Hebrew-sounding way, but in Greek.
Papias says that the sayings of Jesus were written down, and he has this phrase, in the Hebrew dialect. And I would actually interpret that as not that Matthew wrote in Hebrew, but that he wrote in a Hebrew way. He wrote in a very Hebrew style.
So that would be like me saying, hey, Cam, I wrote a book in the English dialect. Would you like to read it? And you're like, yeah, dude, I love reading books written in the English language. And I'm like, whoa. You're jumping to conclusions, man. By English dialect, I meant in an English-sounding way. The book is written in Chinese. That doesn't really check out, right? So when I saw that quote, I knew that they're probably not going to be up to date on this literature, so it's going to be one of those non sequitur debates, probably. And it was. So in order for Wes to say that there was never a Hebrew gospel, means he must not have read any of the literature on this topic from the patristics, because Jerome says on 4 occasions that he translated the Hebrew gospel himself from Hebrew into Greek and Latin. And we have a dozen other early church fathers referencing the Hebrew gospel, most of whom say specifically that it was written by the disciple Matthew in the Hebrew language or dialect, for the sake of the Jews that believe. And so when I heard Stephen say on a podcast that he thinks the Hebrew gospel was just a sayings gospel, that also tells me he must not have read many of the surviving 48 quotes from the Hebrew gospel, because most of them are narrative quotes, not sayings quotes. And also the narrative is in first person tense in the Hebrew gospel, whereas the Greek gospels are in the third person tense. So those were some big points on this topic that I wanted to touch on. But let's go ahead and go through our presentation now, Cam.
Yeah, there's one more thing I want to add to that too, which is that, for everyone watching to understand why there's so much tension around this. And that is because Wes rejecting that there's a Hebrew gospel fits better with the narrative of that these Greek gospels and the Greek tradition is the sound tradition. We don't want to go back there.
The earliest
and look.
one. Yeah.
Exactly. And in fact, what Stephen's doing here by saying, no, the Hebrew gospel and the gospel of Matthew written in Hebrew is 2 different distinct documents is kind of similar to what we're going to talk about later in breaking up the Ebionites from the Ebionim and the 3 different names of Nazarenes. It's just a way to obfuscate a very clear early tradition that will ironically link Jesus more to these first century movements. And I think there's kind of like a cognitive dissonant block to just go and look at that material. And even for the church fathers, Jerome himself knew of the document for many, many years, but it took him a long time, as we'll show, to actually go and translate it for himself and maybe even have some epiphanies around that.
Yeah. And again, we don't fault Wes and Stephen for doing this as apologists. Yeah. That's what apologetics is. It's not about trying to prove something necessarily, but it's about trying to disprove your opponent's argument. And just to kind of gin up enough doubt in the viewer's mind that causes them to doubt your opponent's argument, such as saying, hey, these 2 names, they're probably different gospels. Well, as we're going to show you, the work of scholars like Dr. James Edwards put that theory to rest. They're not 2 different gospels. And the slides we're going to take you through now will demonstrate that. So this is from Dr. Edwards' book. It says, Irenaeus reports that Matthew published among the Hebrews a written gospel also in their own language. So this quote is important because Stephen gets very upset that I added, for the sake of my class and the audience to understand, I added the word Hebrew onto another Irenaeus quote about the Hebrew gospel of Matthew.
There's definitely intentional changes. And as we go through these, you're going to see there's major reconstruction going on.
Because again, I'm teaching my uneducated 40U audience, uneducated on scholarship, I'm trying to help them understand this is the Hebrew gospel, not the Greek gospel Matthew. So I put the word Hebrew in that quote because we have two other quotes where Irenaeus does say Matthew published a Hebrew gospel in their own language. So it goes on to say, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and founding the church. He again writes that the Ebionites used the gospel according to Matthew only and repudiate the apostle Paul, maintaining that he was an apostate from the law. And that's the quote in reference earlier. The Hebrew gospel is not mentioned in this quotation, but Eusebius mentions the gospel in a very similar statement. Presumably drawing on Irenaeus, Eusebius writes that the Ebionites thought that the letters of Paul ought to be wholly rejected and called him an apostate from the law. They used only the gospel according to the Hebrews and made little account of the remaining gospels. So Dr. Edwards here is showing the synonymous reference of this gospel as being gospel according to the Hebrews, gospel according to Matthew, Hebrew gospel of Matthew. This is the way that this text was known back in those days. It's kind of similar to like a football team, right, Cam, where you have, the New England Patriots. And so Patriot fans may refer to their team as New England sometimes, or they'll just call them the Patriots or the Pats, or they'll call them the New England Patriots. There's different ways people refer to things. And so that's what we're seeing here in the patristic quotes. The next slide says, some of these references attribute its use specifically to the sect of the Nazarenes. And this is another tie, by the way, that the Nazarenes and Ebionim, at least in the first century, were likely the same sect, going by two different designations. The Nazarene designation would be for their sect, and the Ebionim was the name of their church or community or congregation. Dr. Edwards says, these frequent but unelaborated references indicate that the Hebrew gospel was sufficiently well known to be assumed as a point of reference for Jerome's readers. So this is also something scholars point to, that clearly all of the references from the patristics show that this text was widely circulated and widely well known. So here's a quote from Jerome from Dialogue Against the Pelagians. In the Gospel according to the Hebrews, which is written in the Chaldean and Syrian language, but in Hebrew characters, and which is used to this day by the Nazarenes, which is of apostolic tradition, or as many assert, according to Matthew, which is also found in the library at Caesarea. So Jerome here is showing you that in the Gospel according to the Hebrews, it's also called according to Matthew, synonymously.
And I just want to add to that too. As you see there with the Syriac language, that's essentially Aramaic, which we know that Jesus probably primarily spoke mostly Aramaic as a street language, as most of the Hebrews at that time did. So this original document, whether it was Aramaic, whether it was Hebrew, whether it was Aramaic style written with Hebrew characters, as we've seen, what it really is it's a truly Hebrew text. And I think that this is a little bit challenging when you've got Wes really dying on the hill that Jesus preached in Greek. So that's probably where some of the tension comes in too, where he just doesn't even think this document exists, or that we don't have it anymore and it's not important.
Well, Stephen actually brought up that there are some surviving fragments of it, apparently.
Oh, wow.
So that's pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. Stephen, let us know. We want to read them.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can read that one, Cam.
Yeah. A second group of references emphasizes the Hebrew character of the gospel, often with the added note that the text was composed by the apostle Matthew. Some of these references simply introduce the gospel as written in Hebrew letters or composed in the Hebrew speech. Others mention that this apostle Matthew wrote the gospel in Hebrew in order to bear witness to Jews or to minister to the Jewish converts. Matthew, also known as Levi, a tax collector who became an apostle, was the first in Judea to compose a gospel of Christ in Hebrew letters and words, on whose account those of the circumcision believed, although it is not certain who later translated the gospel into Greek. Indeed, the Hebrew itself was diligently brought out by Pamphilus the martyr and is still to this day in the library of Caesarea. I have actually had the opportunity to have the volume described to me by people who use it, the Nazarenes of Berea, a city in Syria. And that comes from Jerome in his Dialogue Against the Pelagians, Book 3, Chapter 2. So Jerome goes on to say in another quote, I will now speak of the New Testament, which was undoubtedly composed in Greek, with the exception of the Apostle Matthew, who was the first in Judea to produce a gospel of Christ in Hebrew letters. We must confess that as we have it in our language, it is marked by discrepancies. And now that the stream is distributed into different channels, we must go back to the fountainhead. But Jerome is saying here that there is a source that dates back to an original Hebrew Matthew.
Yeah, many of the scholars I've read on the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew say that This text would have been, and was, and we have the evidence from the patristics for this, but this text would have been widely respected and revered, carrying the reputation of one of the disciples of Jesus writing it. It would have carried tremendous authority in those days. So it makes no sense what Stephen's trying to posit, that there was some completely different gospel, also called that from the Ebionites, that's totally different. That's not how textual traditions work. People do change textual scrolls over time, or manuscripts over time. As theology evolves, that happens. And as Cam said, we acknowledge that possibility in the debate. But this is actually what Jerome is saying, is that all the different channels of the Hebrew gospel by his time in the late 300s really trace back to the single source, the fountainhead, which is the original Hebrew gospel of Matthew. And that's the point we were trying to make in the debate.
Yeah, and I think too, it's important to note that of these potential discrepancies, one that I'm sure Stephen and Wes and even the church fathers seem to declare is one of these discrepancies is Jesus condemning animal sacrificial ritual by saying, I came to abolish the sacrifices, and also rejecting consuming the Passover lamb. But we see this as a more likely thread or original piece preserved because, again, it aligns with these foundational pillars of the movement all the way back to the 3rd century BC of opposition to sacrifices. So I find that interesting. It probably, like it is a challenge for Wes and Stephen, Stephen claimed that this was satanic, a satanic practice of the Ebionites.
Deviated and adopted a satanic practice with a right one. That's what they're saying.
What particular part is the satanic part?
That they chose to abstain from certain meats, dishes that are made a certain way.
And it seems to read that Epiphanius thought the same thing, but it definitely traces back and lines up with those 1st century CE all the way back to 3rd century BC movements.
Okay, next slide here. We're just going to show you a couple more patristic quotes we didn't get into in the debate. This is Origen of Alexandria saying the first gospel was written according to Matthew in the Hebrew dialect. There's Matthew and Hebrew together in one quote. John Chrysostom, Matthew had first preached to the Hebrews. Next we have Hippolytus, writing in early 3rd century. Matthew, having written the gospel in Hebrew, published it in Jerusalem. And then Epiphanius says, they, the Nazarenes, have the gospel according to Matthew quite complete in Hebrew, in the Hebrew dialect. So here's the evidence we mentioned earlier that Stephen must have been unaware of to posit this theory that these are two different gospels, because there's 4 church fathers saying that they are synonymous. These two names always refer to this single text as it, evolved across time. One last really interesting part of the research of Dr. Edwards in this book is that he actually shows very convincingly that Luke, in special Luke, used a Semitic or Hebrew source. And so what Edwards pulls out here is that 93% of all Semitisms used in Luke are unique to Luke. These are the comparisons of Semitisms used in Luke. So this evidence here shows scholars that Luke is clearly using some kind of Hebrew or Semitic source text for his narrative. And the only widely known, widely circulating Semitic document we know of for sure is the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. So Edwards is showing that this gospel would have been extremely widespread and prevalent in those times, and it was so widespread it was probably used as a source document for not just Luke, but probably the other synoptic authors as well.
By the way, notice that he puts no citations to any of his stuff.
So here Stephen says, I don't cite any of my sources, which I think is a bit unfair. Here's a sampling of the sources given in my presentation. And you'll see that actually this page he's quoting is the only page that I don't list the full citation. So here's my explanation for that. I didn't prepare any of these slides for this debate. These, again, are PowerPoint slides from a 4DU class that I teach privately, and I just kind of grabbed this presentation at the last minute to use in our debate, since our position is somewhat nuanced and requires a lot of proofs to back it up. And we just felt like there was no way we could really do that without showing slides and hard proofs on the screen. So these slides I used in a separate presentation for my private community. And if I had known that they were going to be held to the standard of a PhD dissertation, then I probably would have put more citations in it.
They don't care and are deceiving people with clumsy information.
But I'm giving this to my audience in Ford University that aren't scholars and are not familiar with biblical scholarship at all, really. And so you don't want to fire hose people with too many footnotes on the screen. It's better to just show them, here's who said it, here's when they said it. They're just trying to take in the quote itself. They don't really care what book and what line and what chapter it's from.
I would have to question their morality of honesty. Are you deceiving? Are you seeking to lie? One of you is a liar, and in doing it on purpose.
So on this part, Stephen is accusing me of not putting all 4 paragraphs of the quote on my PowerPoint slide from Historia Ecclesiastica 3.27. And again, I'd like to remind you, Stephen, I'm making this presentation for my private community, and I'm trying to make these slides very succinct and neat for them. So I don't care about anything else Eusebius has to say in between these 2 statements. I'm not citing Eusebius to appeal to Eusebius's opinion. We cite the church fathers for one single reason: to use them as a historical reference.
Yeah, and again, I think this is just another example of a non sequitur in arguing our debate topic, and that shows you that they would rather spend more time saying, hey, why aren't you citing your sources? Which again, does it matter? We can give you the sources. Sorry, Stephen, that you had to look around for 2 hours in the middle of the night or whenever it was to find these.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I probably spent 2.5 hours on this one quote.
I know that we would have provided them to you if you would have just asked us. But also, you yourself, even in this video, save a few paragraphs and cut them out for time. So this is just something that we're trying to do to, this has nothing to do with our debate topic. Neither does the opinion of the church fathers themselves. You continually just try to say, these guys are trying to prove their point when these church fathers completely disagree with these groups that they're talking about. We don't care that they disagree with them. We care about the historical documentation of who these groups are.
Right. Because again, the Catholic Church wiped out the Jewish Christians, the Nazarenes and Ebionites. And so we don't have any surviving literature from these Jewish Christian sects. We only have their history in the mouth of their opponents. And anybody who studies Jewish Christianity knows this very well. It's one of the first things you learn. Hegesippus wrote a 5-volume church history book that is now lost to time, and it chronicled every part of Jewish Christian history from the crucifixion of Jesus all the way through 180 AD when he was writing. And the Catholics didn't want you to have that. They didn't want you to know about the true history of Jewish Christianity for very obvious reasons. So we don't have sources from Jewish Christians to go off of. We only have the Catholic Church fathers who hated and maligned them and judged them as heretics. So anytime you see a quote on the screen from a church father, please understand, guys, we're not appealing to their opinion. We're using them as a historical reference.
The quote is that these other apostles, rejected Paul, okay? They thought his teaching was something different because of this, and they denied he was an apostle. It makes it sound like the other apostles being that of the 12.
Right.
Right? So he didn't finish the quote. He didn't finish the commentary because he needed to keep reading what this pseudo-Ambrose says. And notice I underlined it, and I'll highlight it here. But to the Corinthians, Paul was an apostle because they had seen the signs of God's power in him. Okay? Now, so the Corinthians didn't believe that, but apparently the other apostles did, or did they?
So I wanted to point this out because here Stephen says that Paul is a legitimate apostle because he did many signs. Well, I want to remind you, Stephen, Jesus never said, they'll know you're my disciples by your signs and wonders. Jesus said, on that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice wickedness. Matthew 7:22. So Jesus was especially displeased with people who did signs and wonders, but didn't follow his greatest commandment to love others. Second, Paul does not meet either of Jesus' 2 criteria to be a disciple, as listed in Acts chapter 1. Peter says that to be appointed an apostle of Jesus, beginning from the baptism of John until the day he was taken up from us, One of these must become a witness with us to his resurrection. So they chose Matthias to replace Judas because Matthias had witnessed both Jesus' baptism by John and Jesus' resurrection. Paul doesn't meet either of these criteria because Paul never met Jesus. So Paul fails on all three of these criteria of apostleship. Claiming you are an apostle because you do signs and wonders is deceitful behavior. Jesus never said that that was the criteria for apostleship. But in Matthew 24:24, Jesus did say, "For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect." Now, Paul does meet both of these criteria because Paul claims to be an apostle purely based on signs and wonders, multiple times. And Paul was accused by all the Jewish Christians, including James, the brother of Jesus, in Acts 21:21, of apostasy, the ultimate crime under Jewish law, teaching people to forsake the law of Moses. And so Paul is also a majorly failed prophet, as all of his prophecies about Jesus returning in his lifetime, coming on the clouds of heaven, the trumpets will sound, and all of this stuff, none of this ever happened, as Paul prophesied it would. So Paul is a failed prophet that claims apostleship based on doing signs and wonders, which is exactly what Jesus warned us about in Matthew 24. So is it any wonder that the Ebionites repudiated Paul as an apostate? But let's continue.
Even the other apostles, that is, the false apostles who were never with Christ that he already described to us earlier in the commentary.
Right. It makes them sound like Jesus' apostles.
Thought he was teaching something different because of this, and they denied he was apostle, not the 12, because they accepted him, they're a part of him, and Ambrose is admitting that later in chapter 15 in the commentary. This is what happens again when we do not have historical framework. We do not read things in its ultimate historical context.
So I don't think that this is very good exegesis on Stephen's behalf to make these definitive claims that Ambrosiaster is definitely not referring to the 12 disciples, because in chapter 1, he refers to these false disciples and whatnot. In Ambrosiaster's commentary on 1 Corinthians, he does mention the 12 at other points after chapter 1. And so we simply don't know what he means when he says the word apostles. It may not be the 12, or it may be. But the larger point is that this quote from Ambrosiaster, I'm pretty sure he's actually just referencing a quote from the book of Acts. So if you want some historical context, Stephen, you can turn with me to Acts chapter 9, verse 26, which says, "When he had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples," talking about Paul. "And they were all afraid of him, for they did not believe that he was an apostle." So that's all that Ambrosiaster is saying, is that the other disciples didn't think he was an apostle either. So whether or not Ambrosiaster is referring to the 12, we have Acts referring to the 12 being afraid of Paul and not believing he was a disciple. Now, if we go to Paul's own words in 1 Corinthians 9, which is the chapter that's being quoted here, Paul himself says, "If I am not an apostle to others, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord." So this is something Paul would do often, is use the churches he was preaching at to give himself credibility as an apostle of Jesus when he wasn't appointed an apostle of Jesus. Paul is the only one who calls himself an apostle in the entire New Testament. No one else called Paul an apostle other than himself. And what's interesting about 1 Corinthians when you study this letter is that Paul complains a couple of times that he's not getting letters of recommendation from Jerusalem, from James the Just, the brother of Jesus. And you have to ask yourself why. Well, what Paul says to the Corinthians is, "So what if I'm not being given letters of recommendation to come to you? You yourselves are my letter of recommendation." And it's like, no, Paul, no, they're not. If you want to speak under the authority of James the Just, you need his letter of recommendation. And Paul didn't get it. So who is Paul referring to here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9? Even if to others I'm not an apostle, could he be referring to James and the 12 who didn't give him letters of recommendation? I mean, this was the standard practice in those days, as we know, that if you're traveling around representing a church, especially the Jerusalem church of James, you need letters of recommendation to validate your claim to the church you're going to. You can't just show up and say, hey guys, I'm from Jerusalem and let me preach to you. They're like, hey, we don't know who you are, brother. Did you have a letter from the church proving that you're from the church? This was the common practice. And so it's actually a very big deal, and scholars look at this as part of the great schism between Paul and the 12, that Paul wasn't being given letters of recommendation. That means he was teaching things that they thought were against the teachings of Jesus. And again, in Acts 21:21, Paul is on trial before James for apostasia, is the Greek word, teaching people to forsake the law of Moses. So again, whether Ambrosiaster is meaning the 12 or not doesn't really matter, because the Bible tells us that the 12 had big problems with what Paul was teaching.
Read the whole thing. Now notice how it starts out. The evil demon, however, being unable to tear certain others from their allegiance to the Christ of God, yet found them susceptible in a different direction, and so brought them over to his own purposes. The ancients quite properly called these men Ebionites, because they held poor and mean opinions concerning Christ. All right?
You mean like mean opinions that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God? Again, this is clearly showing that he doesn't know all the quotes in reference to the fact that these groups did honor that Jesus was the Messiah. But again, this is once again displaying that he doesn't understand that we don't appeal to these church fathers for their opinion, because these church fathers didn't like these earliest followers of Jesus. They said horrible things about them, namely in regards to their stance against animal sacrifices and flesh consumption. And even Stephen, even Stevens. And even Stephen said in the debate, when I asked him what about it was so bad, he said it was satanic that they didn't offer sacrifices and consume flesh. But from our vantage point, this is a key thread between all of these groups, the prophets of the Old Testament, and the ideal in the kingdom of heaven in Scripture, and ultimately, therefore, Jesus.
Yeah, all of these Jewish Christian groups believe that Jesus was the Messiah that Moses foretold in Deuteronomy 18:15, and in passages like Isaiah 11, which we've mentioned. And we believe the same as well. Doesn't mean you're a heretic and preaching Satanism. All right? So let's continue.
All right. So this is paragraph 1. Paragraph 1. There's 4 paragraphs here. Paragraph 1. And now I didn't put paragraph 2 in for the sake of time. Paragraph 3.
So I just have to point out the rich irony there where Stephen says, I didn't put in paragraph 3 for the sake of time.
And there's a lot of manipulation going on here, Anton. And I even said, Aaron or his source conflated paragraphs 1 and 4. Why the sneakiness? Why the editing?
Well, that's interesting, Stephen, because I also didn't put in paragraphs 2 or 3 in my Eusebius quote to save time. So maybe now you understand why I didn't have nefarious intentions for doing so, but was trying to spare my audience the torture of reading 3 paragraphs of Eusebius's theology on a PowerPoint. But I digress.
So again, Stephen here is going to try to point out that some of the Ebionites are more extreme and different than the other Ebionites, which maybe go back to the Ebionim, but we don't hold that opinion because this is Eusebius' opinion and it's in regards or probably influenced by his own theology. But I do find it interesting that it says that some of them even go as far as respecting the divinity of Christ or the nature of Christ as the Son of God, that some of them even believe that he was born of a virgin and of the Holy Spirit. So there's definitely different opinions amongst these groups, but sorry to keep hammering it. The point that we're interested in is the ones that tie back all the way to the 3rd century BC, especially their opposition to animal sacrifices, which is connected to Jesus.
The ancients quite call these men the Ebionites. Why? Why were they called the Ebionites? He tells you in these sections because they were poor in their thinking and intelligence. It's a criticism out of their ignorance, out of their inability to understand the doctrines of Christ, and their willful ignorance to understand the doctrines of Christ. They were called this by the ancients as criticism, not because they're marking them as a true group.
When he says they weren't called Ebionites because their pockets were poor, because their brains were poor.
Yeah.
You can say, well, I see you're joining in on the hate fest with the church fathers here, Stephen, but I'd like to remind you that the dissertation you read said voluntary poverty was a common characteristic of Ebionism. And here you're saying they weren't called Ebions because they were poor, but because they were dumb. But that's not what you said earlier.
So what I noticed specifically from Cam a lot is the Josiah 6:6. The lying pens of the scribe. Like I memorized the verse because he said it so many damn times. The lying pens of the scribes falsified the Torah.
Well, first of all, I don't want to pick on Anton, but I think it's funny that he called it Josiah 6:6 here. But what's even more funny,
Baby Christian.
yeah, I know he's a baby Christian, and he also, said he has some dyslexia or whatever. But what's even more interesting is that it seems like that Stephen's almost hesitant to even know if it's Jeremiah himself.
Yeah, I think it's Jeremiah 8, somewhere between verse 6, 7, 8, 9, somewhere in there.
And then when he goes on to explain of what it actually means about Jeremiah is that there's intentional changes to the Torah, which is what we're saying.
The lying pen, the lying of the scribe. Because a scribe has the responsibility to give to the people what a text...
We wanted to debate you about this, Stephen, but it seemed like you guys didn't want to. What intentional changes to the Torah do you think Jeremiah is actually talking about?
It's 8:8. Okay.
Yeah, I knew it was a double number. I have dyslexia. It's like it's the 6:6.
Because we already know that he said back in chapter 7, before chapter 8, in verse 22, that God never commanded sacrifices when he brought them out of Egypt. So if there are sacrifices in the Torah now, when Jeremiah is writing and saying the lying pen of the scribes has falsified the Torah, is actually the animal sacrificial ritual being inserted into the text. After all, we do know this was condemned by almost 50% of the prophets in the Old Testament, all the way through the time of Jesus, who also vehemently opposed it when he went into the temple in Mark, shut it down, didn't allow anyone to bring animals in, and freed them from the temple, the cattle, sheep, and all, as John says. So this seems like a pretty big deal and a very tense and divisive issue in Jewish history, to say the least. And that's what we're positing, is that an entire sect of Judaism branched off over this issue, the Nazarenes and the Ebionim.
When Stephen said, I think that's in Jeremiah, I was honestly shocked, Cam, because it's like, how you have a verse in the Bible, Jeremiah 8:8, that says, the Torah has been corrupted by the lying pen of the scribes. Well, the full verse says, how can you say we are wise, for the law of the Lord is with us, when behold, the lying pen of the scribes has falsified it. It's like a Christian saying, we're wise because we have the Bible. And yet the Bible says the scribes corrupted the Bible. So what other conclusion can you come to when Jeremiah is one of the most anti-sacrifice prophets in the Old Testament? And strangely, Cam, they didn't actually push back on Jeremiah 8:8. I've heard some apologists say, well, Jeremiah doesn't mean the scribes wrote the lies in the Torah.
Right.
It just means that they're not following the law as the scribes wrote it, or something like that. Right. And there's no context of, oh, you're not following the law properly. The quote is very clear in Jeremiah 8:8. The pen of the scribes is putting lies into the Torah. And apparently Stephen's not even that familiar with the passage. So now we understand more why there was this lack of understanding between us, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I get it that there's a whole conversation that we could have about a more simple Torah and why is it that animal sacrifices would be the thing left out. We have some really good evidence in 2 Kings and some manuscript proof that points in the direction that this is the case. But without even having to get into that, like we said in 7:22, he says that God never commanded animal sacrifices. But then before that, in that same chapter, in verse 7:11, is when he condemns the temple as a den of quote unquote thieves or robbers, as we have it translated. But the original Hebrew paritz most accurately means a violent one or even a murderer. And there's no person being murdered in the temple. It's animals. It's the animal sacrificial ritual that he's condemning and the priests who are participating in it. And interesting that that's the very quote that Jesus quotes when he's in the temple condemning those priests 400 or 500 years after Jeremiah. And I believe, and I know you do too, Aaron, that this is why maybe people were confusing Jesus with Jeremiah in the Gospels. They even mentioned, is this Jeremiah? Because he's taking the same stance and really fulfilling this understanding that God never wanted this.
Yep. Jeremiah said, you've turned my father's house into a den of paritz, violent ones.
Yeah. And I wanted to just on this note, mention that this came up in the debate, this whole conversation around paritz. And just like the Hebrew gospel, Stephen and Wes didn't really want to address it. They wanted to pull me back into the Greek New Testament with Jesus's words saying den of thieves rather than the Hebrew Jeremiah, which he was quoting. And they were positing that he said the Greek word lestes.
Lestes. You getting the lestes?
Yeah, lestes. Yeah, it allows for multiple translations, and one could be murder.
And I also want to say that the way that they were speaking about it, number one, let me know that I don't think they actually even watched my film Christspiracy, which goes into great detail about the research that we did on this, which I find interesting going into a debate and not actually looking at the person's material. But beyond that, it was like they were trying to take and hone in on the exact argument I wasn't saying. I was positing that Jesus would have said Hebrew when he's condemning Hebrew priests in a Hebrew temple on a Hebrew holiday of Passover. It would have been paritz. So again, this is just this pattern that we see where it's like, stay away from the Hebrew, stay away from the original traditions. Let's keep it late if we can, you know?
Let's keep it as Greco-Roman as possible, right?
Yeah.
My problem, why I get a little charged about this, is because they're not giving Jesus the divine nature that he had, and it's wrong because they don't just have a conspiracy theory. They're actually doing what all other religions do, all other cults do, strip away the divinity from Christ. And it's so unfair to new believers and current believers. It's just wild.
So no, Anton, actually, the way we see it is that you're trying to strip away the divinity of Christ in every person you see when you say that Jesus is exclusively God. We exalt Christ's divinity to the highest possible level, making his divinity omnipresent everywhere, in everyone, and in all things. Even John chapter 1 says, all things were made through him, or the Christ, and without the Christ, the Logos, nothing was made. And so this is why Jesus said, when you didn't love the least of these, you didn't love me. And love your neighbor as yourself. Why? Because Christ saw Christ in everyone. And so part of our Jesus way philosophy is that we practice seeing Christ in everyone as Jesus commanded us. While you, on the other hand, strip the divinity of Christ away from everyone and everything in the whole universe and give it only to one physical body, the body of Jesus in the first century. Only that one person is God. And yet even John 1 says that Christ was in the beginning before anything was made, before the human person Jesus was ever incarnated. And so this is also, by the way, what the Ebionim believed, that the Christ was a divine eternal principle and was incarnated in the body of Yeshua in the first century. And it appears that Yeshua was aware of this himself. So we don't agree with you that we're trying to strip away the divinity of Christ. We actually see it quite the reverse.
Oh my goodness. I probably spent 2.5 hours on this one quote.
So I feel bad watching this when Stephen says he spent 2.5 hours searching for one quote. I know the pain, Stephen. We go through the same thing, searching for church father quotes, and it can be very painstaking. So again, kind of bummed you didn't just hit me up, dude, because I have all these quotes saved in my note files, and I would have gladly told you where the quote could be found. But
so I went through this, and I finally found a scanned image of a Latin text of Jerome's commentary, and it was really hard for me to do that because the whole thing was in Latin.
So this one was funny because this was like their big buildup, like the big reveal of like the ultimate proof that Aaron's cheating and lying. Because I added the word, the ebion, in the quote, the Jerome quote in quotations, which I put it in quotations to show that it's not original to the quote.
There's nothing here about the Ebionites. Zero. The Latin does not use this word at all. This is an assertion that Jerome does not have in his mind. In fact, he is referring to the poor in the sense of materialism to start his entire paragraph.
So I'd like to remind you that this was for a class I taught in 40U, where I'm trying to help my students connect the dots on these points because this is all new information to them. And so I'm trying to help them remember that the poor, remember the Hebrew word is the ebion. So if Jerome's referring to a group of Hebrew Christians in the first century that are called the holy poor, that's likely in the Hebrew word Ebion. So I put that designation in quotes to show that this isn't original to Jerome's quote. I'm just adding it for reference and context for the viewers to remember, oh yeah, the poor is the Ebion in Hebrew. So there's your explanation, Stephen.
Who are actually the sect of what became the Ebionites in the narrative of the commentary. It's not the people that are the poor getting the offerings taken up for them. It's the people who made them poor. It's the people who actually adhere to the law instead of the crucified man, who are actually persecuting their own family and friends and taking their jobs and lands and persecuting them because they have rejected the law to follow the crucified Jesus.
So right here, Stephen's trying to draw a distinction that the Ebionites that we're referring to in Epiphanius's work that are adhering to the law are different to the Ebionim because they're actually forsaking the law and following Jesus, and that these later Ebionites are more like the Orthodox Jews of the time, which are condemning the Ebionim of Jesus's time for forsaking the law. But that's a total conflation, and it's not accurate, because what we're saying is that these original Ebionim, they didn't fully forsake the law of Moses. They just forsook the liturgical laws, the 600 plus extra additional laws that Jesus is continually questioning all throughout the Gospels. But they held true to the original Mosaic law, which is, the 10 Commandments, and specifically, thou shalt not kill, including animals for sacrifice. And the Orthodox Jews of the time consider them heretical for rejecting the law because they reject sacrifice, not because they're rejecting Moses altogether.
Yeah, here's the best example to help people understand this. It's exactly what happens today with the Bible. Cam and I do not read the Bible literally or as an inerrant, infallible text. We read it in a very different way than Christians do, from a historical, critical perspective, and we study the Bible as a document. And so Christians tell us, oh, you don't follow the Bible at all. Oh, you just throw the Bible in the trash. You don't care about the Bible and things like that. That's not our opinion of our relationship to the Bible. We would say, absolutely not. We actually feel that we're giving the Bible more respect than you are in the way that we study it and interpret it. And so the same is true for the Ebionites, in that the Ebionites' Jewish opponents were accusing them of forsaking the law. But the Ebionites, would not have said that of themselves. They would have said, oh, no, we keep the real law. You guys, the Orthodox Jews, you're following a false, corrupted law. That's not what Moses originally gave us. So both camps think they follow the law the right way, just like Christians and non-Christians both think they interpret the Bible the right way. So to confuse the accusation about the Jewish Christians with their actual beliefs would be bad exegesis, in my opinion.
You have Judaism, and now there's these Jewish people who have rejected Judaism's system, and now they're being alienated from the Judaism family and kicked out of their homes. They're losing their inheritances.
So here Stephen says that they were called the poor because they lost everything to follow Jesus. So Stephen here seems to be taking this Jerome quote way out of context to claim that all the Jewish Christians lost everything when they converted. There is no evidence or data to support that claim anywhere. But we do have multitudinous evidence, both from the book of Acts, the church fathers, and even the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they voluntarily gave everything up to join the Jewish Christian sect, the Ebionim, the poor ones. And so in the very Jerome quote Stephen is referencing here, Jerome says they either lay down their possessions or they were persecuted by their own kin. So Jerome is saying that the Jewish Christians literally could not survive in the first century without joining the Ebionim, the congregation of the poor, because otherwise they would be persecuted by the Orthodox Jews, their own kin. So it's a pretty wild claim to make that they weren't called the poor ones because of their voluntary poverty style of living, but just because they lost everything to follow Jesus. That's just not what Jerome even says, and there's no evidence to support that claim. But besides that, all sects of Ebionites that we know of all accepted Jesus as the Messiah, and all practiced, as your dissertation said, Stephen, voluntary poverty as a characteristic of Ebionism. So there's the two direct links, again, to the holy poor that Jerome is describing in this quote.
I think this is a good framework to understand that these groups were both rejected by the Orthodox Jews of their time and then eventually by the Orthodox Christians later on. And that's why we don't have hardly anything surviving, and why we have to rely on church fathers whose opinions are so mean of them to even understand what they were about. But what we do know is that this Nazarene name, it seems to come earlier, which we'll get into later in Epiphanius. And it's because they saw themselves in that Isaiah 11 as a branch off of Judaism. And they thought that was a good thing because they were starting a new and more pure form or restoring Judaism. But obviously the Orthodox Jews saw that as a bad thing. So that's why they condemned the Nazarenes. They curse the Nazarenes in their Talmud. And also Jesus, when he's crucified on the cross, is, there's the sign, Jesus the Nazarene, is like a condemnation. Then later, because Jesus preached about the poor and they had such a high regard for the poor and really being humble in that way, they took it on themselves as, the poor ones. But this becomes a condemnation over time as poor in intellect and all of this. So it's hard to know if these groups, fully came up with their names because they were, attesting to the scripture, if it was something that was kind of a slander against them. But what we do know is that these names designate a thread or a group of people that were against animal sacrifice. They had voluntary poverty, ritual atonement, baptism as a replacement for animal sacrificial ritual. And as we said before, a condemnation of writings and later Christianity, under Paul's letters.
Why not include this quote of Epiphanius? The argument that they're making is that Jesus is a Nazarene, not because he's from Nazareth, but because he's a part of a group that was before him. But if you read the whole quote, that's not what Epiphanius is actually saying. He's saying the name Jesus of Nazareth came from his town he grew up in and mentions Joseph's home. Okay?
So it's interesting here that Stephen says that they prove that Nazareth was a real place archaeologically, because I'm pretty sure I'm the only one that actually brought that up in the debate when I said that I do know that there's archaeological evidence of a hamlet or a village based on pottery and these types of things, but we don't have evidence of a town named Nazareth until 200 years after Jesus' death in any historical record. It's not in Josephus, it's not in the Talmud, it's not in the Old Testament. So the question that arises is, are Nazarenes called Nazarenes because they're from Nazareth, or is it the other way around? Was there a sect of Nazarenes that emerged earlier and then the place of Nazareth is named after them, or maybe even named after Jesus? We don't know because we don't have record. But when we read Epiphanius and we understand how far back these groups go and this ideal against animal sacrifice all the way to the prophets in Isaiah's Netzer, the branch that shall come that will bring this kingdom and heavenly vision with no slaughter in the temple, then we know that it's very possible that this group would have branched off much longer before a town named Nazareth became a town of that name, if that makes sense. So just want to clear that up, that we're not saying that Nazareth doesn't exist. You can go look on a map right now. We're saying, when did it actually become called that? And is it more important that Nazarene is a religious title, not just denoting a place of someone's origin? I mean, the funny thing is, you can even go to Wikipedia right now, anyone, and look up Nazarene as a title on Wikipedia, and it'll tell you that Jesus the Nazarene or Nazarean, two different Greek spellings, are irregular in Greek, and the additional vowel in Nazarean complicates any derivation of a place called Nazareth, meaning that word doesn't really connect linguistically to meaning someone from Nazareth.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, Acts 24:5 already debunks what Stephen is trying to say here, that Nazarene was just a designation of where Jesus came from. It was not a religious sect. Well, in Acts 24:5, Paul is on trial, and he is accused of being the ringleader of the Nazarene sect, the followers of the way. So we know that Nazarenes definitely was a religious sect, not just a designation of where Jesus was from.
He's saying the name that they had was actually the Nazareans, when actually they were called the Essenes before the disciples. He's saying the Nazarenes were before the disciples began to be called Christians in Antioch. False. When actually it was the Essenes name that was used before, not the Nazarenes.
So this was another weird one because Stephen is trying to argue that this quote says that they were not called Nazarenes, but they were called Essenes. And the quote on the screen clearly says, all Christians alike were called Nazarenes. They also came to be called Essenes for a short while, and then eventually Christians. So Epiphanius is saying here that they, at the earliest point of the Jesus movement, they were known by these two names, Nazarenes and also Essenes. Stephen is again trying to divide those two things and make them separate and say, no, they weren't called Nazarenes. They were only called Essenes. But I think the quote on the screen shows that that's not the correct interpretation.
Yeah. And I would just add to that again, this is only still just proving our thesis again, because if you go back to Isaiah 11, it says a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, and his roots a branch, which is the Nazarene. That's those two words. So it's showing they called themselves the Nazarenes, the branch people from Isaiah, but they came to be called also at some time Essenes because of the stump of Jesse. It's all from this same text.
And this is a very popular thing that Hebrew people would do in these days. If they were trying to show parallels to prophecies in the Old Testament, they would sometimes even name their own group or sect after something from that prophecy to try to show, hey, we are the fulfillment of that prophecy, or we're part of that affiliation.
So he conflated 3 paragraphs and 3 names to form that one line. That's why I said it sounds like, oh, one little line. What could you possibly spend time talking about it? A lot, because a lot is happening, and he made a major mistake in that quote.
So, Aaron, I don't want to speak for you on this, but it's clear that you wrote the Nazarenes were before Christ with a Z, because these words are all phonetically the same. Nazarene spelled with a Z, Nazarene with an A at the end, Nazarene with an S. Phonetically, they're all the same word. And it's clear that they all go back to this same root of Isaiah 11, the Netzir, the branch, because this was a new branch that was coming off of Judaism, which rejected, sacrifice in the temple. They will not kill on my holy mountain.
And that Hebrew word destroy there has a root that actually means to slaughter an animal, to sacrifice.
But what he's trying to say here is he's trying to point out that the Nazarenes with an S, a sigma, are a completely separate group because Epiphanius is saying they are. Now, firstly, I almost find it, if I was a person who was easily offended, that I would be a little bit offended that he thinks that maybe I haven't looked into this super deeply, which again shows me that he hasn't watched Christspiracy, because this is a big hinge point of our documentary. I have the book of the Panarion right here. I've read through this so many times and thought of all these things for years now. And like we've said before, it's clear that Epiphanius has a theological agenda with breaking this group apart into multiple different names. I'm not the only one to say this. There are other scholars who have posited this idea. And it's pretty telling when you understand that the S in the sigma and the zeta in Greek, which goes from the S of Nazarenes to the Greek Nazarenes, is a common linguistical shift that happens in Greek. In fact, the word for Asians in Greek started out as an S, the older version, and became a Z or a zeta later in time. So this is nothing, to make a big deal about. And I feel that Epiphanius was making a big deal about it in the 4th century because he was really frustrated that these people rejected animal sacrifice and even flesh consumption, and thought that the law of Moses had been corrupted. And it seems that the nature of Stephen and Wes in this instance is to jump on that bandwagon and try to split them apart and, say they're all different people when they just aren't.
How dare those Satanists think it's wrong to murder animals? You know what I mean? Unbelievable, says Epiphanius.
And Epiphanius, trying to focus on these multiple different spellings for the same group, is really telling when you look into the Greek New Testament and you realize that the term Jesus the Nazarene is spelled two different ways as well in the same New Testament. So it's not a big deal. It's phonetically the same.
Another big point for sure.
It almost like hurts to have to explain this stuff. I'm like,
I know.
I feel for the viewers are like, I don't kill. It's like,
so Josephus, he makes this quote here about the Essenes, right? Here's the most anti-woman, woman's rights statement you could ever have. They guard against marrying women because they believe that no woman can be faithful to a single man. I found that really interesting.
You just can't make this stuff up.
So I don't even want to get into this super deeply. They're bringing up this Josephus quote about the Essenes. Again, we made the claim very strongly in our debate that the Essenes is not a term that shows up in their own documents. So we don't even really know where that term comes from. But he's trying to, talk about how these Essenes in particular have this idea about women. But the point is Epiphanius, when he talks about in the Panarion, the different groups or sects of Jews, Essenes are not mentioned, but guess who are? The Nazarenes. And guess what? The Nazarenes believed in marriage and traditional ideas around that. So this is just a moot point that he's making.
The Essenes do not offer sacrifices because they have more pure illustrations of their own. And that's
their narrative being fulfilled right there.
Yeah, our narrative is being fulfilled there against animal sacrifices. But again, like we said, the word Essene doesn't appear in the ancient documents. But what we do know is that Epiphanius shows that the different sects of Judaism, Nazarenes are included, and they are against animal sacrifice and flesh consumption. So this does line up with what's being said here. Because remember, they're conflating Essenes and Ebionites. What did the Ebionites continue, to do? He's saying here, the doctrine of the Essenes is this, that they did go to the temple.
Right. And Aaron and Cam was saying they rejected the temple.
Right.
So something to clear up here is that we never said the Jewish Christians were against the temple in general. Our point is that they were against what was happening in the temple, which is the sacrificial system. And that's actually what Josephus says in this quote. It clearly says that they send offerings to the temple, but that they are excluded from entering the temple. So nowhere in this passage does Josephus say that they went into the temple. It actually says they were banned from entering the temple. So this quote does not support the point that Stephen's trying to make here.
Yeah, and even interestingly, it says of the Essenes and the Qumran group in the Encyclopedia Britannica that they shunned temple worship and were content to live ascetic lives in seclusion. So it does sound like what Epiphanius is saying there. And also, there's a quote from a well-respected scholar, Dr. Joel Ham, the chair of biblical studies at some Bible college and theological seminary, who has a PhD in Old Testament language and exegesis from Fuller. He says it's clear that the Essenes or the Qumran group rejected the Jerusalem temple, or at least its priesthood. And that's our point. Whether they rejected the temple itself or not, they rejected what was happening there, these animal sacrificial rituals. So they were complete separatists and didn't even want to participate in the politics or the temple system. So I don't really understand it. It's like every single point in this presentation that Stephen's doing, he's trying to tear down little nuances, but somehow getting the opposite conclusion of what the quote's saying and inadvertently proving our point.
Mary and Joseph, if they were a part of the Essenes and this was a part of their group, they are not going to be bringing the doves, the pigeons. They're not going to be bringing the birds. They're going to bring one of these offerings right here. But they didn't do that, did they?
So here's the problem with using or relying on the synoptics as a historical record. We were trying to explain this during the debate. You can't just read the synoptics like a history textbook. We don't know if any of the things in these books actually historically happened because, for example, the virgin birth narratives between Matthew and Luke are extremely contradictory. Matthew says that King Herod made a decree that all firstborn sons must be put to death. And so then how would Luke's account make any sense where Jesus or Joseph and Mary, after Jesus' birth, go to the temple, boot down the door and say, we've got a new firstborn son and we're ready to offer our turtle doves as sacrifice for his birth. I mean, they're fleeing, supposedly, from Herod trying to kill their son. Why would they go to the Jerusalem temple to publicly announce their newborn son? King Herod ruled the temple. The second temple was built by Herod and is also called Herod's temple. So if the Luke and Matthew narratives are both true, that would mean that Mary and Joseph literally brought Jesus to Herod on a silver platter, which is very unlikely. So it's unlikely that one of these is a historical event, or perhaps both. And so these are the things that scholars look at and say, at least one of these accounts isn't adding up. It's quite possible that both of them are completely made up. But these gospel accounts were written, again, by Greek-speaking Gentile Christians who never met Jesus nor anybody in Jesus' family 50 plus years after his death. So we cannot read these as historical accounts. Some of these accounts, some of these stories in the synoptics may have never happened. But it's also very likely that some of them did happen. So we just simply don't know. And so appealing to the synoptic gospels as a history reference is just circular reasoning and question begging, because you have no way of proving that these are historically accurate accounts that really happened. But we do have lots of historical attestation from numerous different sources that Jesus definitely opposed animal sacrifice. We have attestation from the Greek Gospels, the Hebrew Gospel, the Syriac Aramaic Gospels, and the church fathers such as Eusebius and Origen. And we'd just like to point out that while we're on this topic, Wes and Stephen made no mention of our two most important patristic quotes from Eusebius, which I'll read for you again right now. In Proof of Gospel 3.3, Eusebius says, "He, Jesus, has not ordained that God should be honored with sacrifices of bulls or the slaughter of unreasoning beasts. He thought these things low and earthly and quite unworthy of the immortal nature of God, and judged the most acceptable and sweetest sacrifice to God to be the keeping of his own commandments." And in Proof of Gospel 1.10, Eusebius says, "He, Jesus, did not enjoin sacrifices or require them, nor did he command the observance of bodily circumcision, nor did he lay down any of the other various precepts of Moses, except the spiritual laws, which he bade us observe." And if that wasn't enough, we also have more quotations on this we could show that we didn't get to show during the debate because we got cut off by Anton. But here from Origen and against Celsus, he says, "The blood of sacrifices was not required by the Most High, nor was he pleased with the odor of burnt offerings. Jesus came to do away with these sacrifices and to call people to a higher spiritual worship." Then we actually have the Epistle of Barnabas, which is one of the older texts that was considered canonical for quite a few centuries. Epistle of Barnabas is in Codex Sinaiticus, and it dates to the 1st or 2nd century. And in the Epistle of Barnabas, it says, "He abolished the sacrifices, lest you should place your trust in them." So all of our earliest sources here continually corroborate this idea that this historical man named Yeshua the Nazarene, if we know one thing about him, we definitely know he was not a fan of animal sacrifices and probably opposed them angrily in such a way that actually got him killed. And in the Gospel of Mark, we know that it says, after Jesus said these things, when he opposes the temple system, the priests sought how they would put him to death. So it was Jesus' opposition to the temple system, the temple sacrificial system, that ultimately was the reason the priest said, we got to get rid of this guy. So to even pretend like Jesus wasn't against sacrifices or would have been pro-sacrifice to us is quite a laughable position for scholars to hold. I mean, the only piece of evidence Wes and Stephen brought to the debate to debunk us on this point is one passage from Luke where Jesus tells a leper he heals to go and show himself to the priest and offer the sacrifice. And we debunked that pretty easily by stressing that Jesus was always emphasizing that people are more important than ritual laws. And he castigated the Pharisees for upholding ritual laws over people. Jesus always did the opposite. And so we said, of course, Jesus healing a leper who was outcast from society would tell him to go and do something, do the things that he has to do to be accepted back into society. Because to Jesus, the leper, the man, was more important than the stupid ritual offering he had to give to the priest. And when I said this point to Wes, that Jesus says, isn't man made for the Sabbath, or is Sabbath made for man? Showing that Jesus prioritized people above ritual laws, Wes agreed to that point.
Jesus' whole MO is that people are the most important thing in God's universe. Loving
Correct.
your neighbor as yourself is far more important than any ritual laws. So yes, Jesus would have definitely prioritized the person he healed being put back in the community than some stupid commandment that he doesn't agree with.
Right. Yeah, and I would agree with that.
That was the only rebuttal they brought to the debate. And we have, 10 plus lines of evidence showing that Jesus was definitely against animal sacrifice.
Yeah. And I would just add, because we are talking about that moment in the debate, that one point I tried to keep getting across, which they didn't engage with, is that regardless of what Luke records Jesus did, which we know it's the recollection according to that particular document, Jesus, it says that he tells the leper, go and tell no one and show yourself to the priest for the offering of Moses. But he goes and tells everyone and doesn't go to the priest.
The guy doesn't go offer the sacrifice, though.
He doesn't go do the offering. So in the same light of Jesus having foreknowledge, being, in some divine messianic nature, he would have known, obviously, that this guy wasn't going to go do that. It's similar to the idea of the woman caught in adultery, where he says, stone this woman if you have no sin. He doesn't want people to actually stone the woman. He's trying to prove a point.
Yeah, and again, we don't know if that story is a historical event that happened exactly as Luke has it. A Gentile scribe from 80, 90 AD, writing in Luke, could have easily just thought, well, I know Jesus was a Jew, and isn't there a commandment in Levitical law about a cleansing of a leper and they have to offer something? Thinking that, okay, if Jesus was a Jew, he probably did that, so let's add that into the story. It could be as simple as that. We don't know because we can't prove either way. What we do know, again, is that Jesus opposed animal sacrifice. So scholars look at those passages and say, that's a little bit iffy because that's very contradictory to the character of Jesus we see. But if Jesus did do it, like we said, if that was a historical event that happened, it would have been because Jesus was prioritizing the person over the ritual. So there you have that.
Bro, you don't even know who Jesus is. Like,
Oh, man.
you guys claim you believe in God as Jesus, but you clearly don't. This guy's just another heretic. He's another Pharisee pretending to be a lover of God, and he's going around deceiving people, and I have a soft spot for that. So I am going to put him in a position where he's very uncomfortable to get the truth out of him. What do you believe, dude? Do you believe you are God? I asked him that because New Agers believe they're God.
So I'm glad we get to end the video on this topic because I want to address a couple things here for you, Anton, about your perspective on all of this. The way you share about this shows me that you're not super well versed in things like non-dual philosophy or any of the philosophical systems you label as being New Age. And that's totally fine. I wouldn't expect you to be familiar with those philosophies, but I'm still surprised you struggle to understand my position here so much because I've told you many times exactly what I believe. And it's especially interesting that you seem to not understand my position because you're an Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Christian. And theosis is one of the principal doctrines of Eastern Orthodoxy. I love the doctrine of theosis very much, and it's what intrigued me so much about EO, is that I believe the universe exists for the sake of theosis, for all sentient beings to grow and evolve closer to God. And theosis, by the way, is also sometimes called deification or divinization because it's the process by which we participate in the divine nature. So, Anton, how can you participate in the divine nature of God, as Eastern Orthodoxy teaches you, if you're not one with God? That would seem pretty obvious, right? But in addition to that, I want to also stress that nobody I know or have ever met in the New Age movement thinks that they're God, or at least not in the way that you think Jesus was God. Nobody calls themselves God or thinks of themselves that way. That's sort of just your projection coming from a Christian perspective. People outside of Christianity who have a devoted spirituality will say that they are one with God, but that's a very different claim than claiming to be exclusively God. I've never met anybody who thinks that they're exclusively God. And in addition to that, Anton, you tried to tell me at the end of the debate that I'm New Age or New Thought.
You're in a different category called New Thought, which is something we could talk about in depth. It's not quite New Age. It's kind of this nuanced thing. So
thanks for that. But I want you to know that I don't consider myself New Age. And honestly, I have no idea what that term even means. I'm not sure if that term refers to a philosophical system or a cultural movement. I'm not sure what anybody means by that term, but I know it's just kind of used as a label to distance from people who believe differently. So let me give you the New Age oneness with God. To say I am one with God means I am a ray of light coming from the sun. The ray is the sun as well as a ray. But nobody would say that the sun is a ray of light. The sun is much more than a single ray of light. And so that's why no single person can claim to be God. This is why Jesus never said, I am God, or I am Yahweh, as Wes quoted him saying. Nobody can claim to be exclusively God. That's an ontological fallacy. God cannot be limited down to one human body. But you can look at anything in the universe and say, you're God, because everything is a manifestation of God. Simple. So Jesus himself said this in John 10:34 when he said, isn't it written, you are gods? So in any mystical tradition, saying I am God is very frowned upon and taboo, because this is a statement that could really only be coming from the ego. God doesn't need to say I am God any more than I have to wake up in the morning and look at myself in the mirror and say, I am a man, I am Aaron Abke, I am such and such years old. You don't have to affirm what you know that you are. So to say, I am God, would be an egoic statement. I am one with God is the correct way of saying that, because you're not claiming exclusivity. So when you ask me the question, Aaron, do you think you're God? I know what you mean when you ask that, which is, do you think you're exclusively God like I think Jesus was exclusively God? And the answer is no. But if you ask me, are you one with God? The answer is a resounding yes. So when I hear you or any other Christian ask me, are you God?
because Aaron, do you believe you are God?
I feel a bit like a drop of salt water being asked, are you the whole ocean? Like, well, it should be obvious I'm not the whole ocean. But yet, a drop of salt water is made up of nothing but the ocean. So you see, there's a distinction, but there's no fundamental difference. And so the same is true of God. I am a ray of light coming from the sun. If you've seen me, you've seen the sun. But the Father is greater than I. The Son is greater than I. There's still the acknowledgement that God is transcendent, beyond all things visible. And so nothing that is visible can claim to be exclusively God. So hopefully now we're on the same page on the topic of Jesus's divinity, and you and other Christians don't have to keep asking me anymore if I believe I'm God.
Dude, I really hope people watch this. I really hope people watch this, because this is...
All right, so that about wraps up the video from Anton and Stephen. And as we just saw together, there was no lying, no manipulating, and no deception. There was just a misunderstanding of our intention on behalf of Anton, Stephen, and Wes. And I want to highlight this as we close, because I think this is a big point, that you guys jumped to the conclusion that we were lying and cheating and all these things and went straight to the internet with these public accusations without so much as even talking to either of us, even though we told you we'd be happy to answer any questions you have about our presentation during the debate. And I mean, Anton, you have my number. You have Cam's number, bro. I told you I consider you a friend and a brother. And if you ever need anything, you can come talk to me. And I really meant that. So my question is, if you thought I was lying or manipulating, why not ask me directly? Jesus was very clear on how to handle situations like this. In Matthew 18:15, Jesus said, if your brother sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. And Jesus also said, Do unto others as you wish them to do unto you. And I think it'd be fair to say that you're probably not treating Cam and I how you would want to be treated. Jesus also said, the one who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me. And you are my friends if you do what I command you. So again, this whole situation really proves my larger point about Christianity, that it doesn't really care or stress what Jesus taught. Because I think if you cared half as much about following Jesus's commandments as you clearly care about having the right sort of theological beliefs about him, then you would have handled this situation the way Jesus taught us to handle our grievances with our brothers. And so I think this is also why the statistics show that Christianity is in steep decline. ChurchTrack.com had a published study that showed 1.2 million Americans per year are leaving Christianity. That's a pretty staggering statistic. And I think it's because of hypocrisy just like this, that people are tired of being told they just have to believe in the right set of doctrines or else they're a heretic. People want the real Jesus and what Jesus actually taught. And that's why Cam and I are so passionate about teaching the Jesus way to the world. So with all that being said, Cam, you got any closing thoughts for us?
Yeah, Aaron, look, at the end of the day, like you said, we love Jesus. We aim to follow Jesus. And the reality is we want to be close to Jesus, so close that this is the intention of why we're going all the way to the first century and looking at these movements, the Nazarenes, the Ebionites, because through these threads, we see Jesus. And we want to know who actually knew him. We want to know what he actually stood for: love, mercy, the kingdom of heaven ideal, which has no slaughter in Isaiah 11. And it's ironic that in the debate, Stephen said that holding that perspective against animal sacrifice, per his Epiphanius quote, was satanic. When on the flip side, in Amos 5:25, it says very clearly, did you ever offer animal sacrifices in the wilderness? And equates animal sacrifice to literal satanic practices like Baal worship and Moloch worship. And the biggest irony of all is the first martyr, Stephen, of your own namesake, Stephen, was literally stoned to death after he claimed and declared Amos 5:25 to the priesthood at the temple. And guess who was standing over his dead body as this was happening? Saul, who goes on to become Paul, who goes on to be a foundational person of the Christian kind of perspective that these church fathers hold, which is this condemnation against that early first century movement. And so, if for anything, Stephen, for your own namesake and for the first martyr, take a moment, dive into the material. We'd love to have another conversation. I'll have a conversation with you anytime on or off the record. In fact, I saw it in our debate that Wes seemed to back out and not want to give a closing statement because he stood on your closing statement. In your closing statement, I saw you shift into that mindset of, well, yeah, Jesus did do away with the sacrifices. I could see that you were thinking about it, and I know that you find it to be a compelling thing at some level. So let's get out of the he said, she said, the drama, trying to paint each other with ad hominems. And let's just really talk about the material, and let's get down to who Jesus the Nazarene really was.
Yeah. Yeah, we truly hope you don't take any personal offense to our disagreements throughout this video with the points that you guys made. I said this to you both in the debate, and I meant it, that I love you guys. And although we have disagreements over theology and biblical exegesis and whatnot, neither of those things are all that important to Cam and I, because what's most important is following the Jesus way, to love your neighbor as yourself. And so we want you guys to know we love you both. We highly respect you. We think you're doing great work in your fields. And so it's been cool to keep this debate going a little bit. And so we appreciate the opportunity to do that. And to everybody else watching, if you want to go deeper into this with us, you can, number one, check out our new podcast, the Jesus Way podcast. We'll put a link for that in the description below. And Cam's amazing film, Christspiracy.
And in Christspiracy, we really go deep on the animal sacrificial ritual piece and the Nazarenes as well. It was a 5-year journey, traveling all around the world, looking into this from a perspective of an engaging documentary film. So definitely, if you could sit through this, you can sit through that and watch it, and I promise that you will come out on the other side at least entertained, if anything else.
Oh, no doubt about that, brother. Christspiracy is my favorite all-time documentary I've ever seen, so highly recommend it. And we'll put the link for that in the show notes below as well. All right, guys, that wraps it up for this video. Until next time, love God, love people, and we'll see you on the next one.